Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm really excited to be speaking with Dr. Andy Hill. Andy, it's great to have you on the show.
Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. Really excited to talk to you today. Why don't we get started by getting you to introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Great. So I am Professor Andy Hill, and I am a Professor of Sport and Exercise Psychology at York St John University.
And we're here today to talk about a topic that I think probably takes up quite a lot of your time. It's an area of interest for me, perfectionism. We're going to specifically talk about a book chapter of yours on perfectionism. It's an area that I find fascinating, Andy, because having a background in professional golf, and I think golf can lend itself towards a bit of a perfectionistic attitude. It's something that I feel that I've lent towards in the past. So I'm going to be really interested to explore this area with you, and specifically we're going to be talking about myths of perfectionism. But just if we can start out, just give me some background to your interest in the area of perfectionism, if you can.
Yeah, sure. So my background is in sport and exercise science, and so that's what I studied at undergraduate level. And through my studies, I encountered someone called Professor Howard Hall, and he was just about to start a line of research examining perfectionism in sport. So perfectionism has a kind of a long, illustrious history outside of sport, but it's a relatively new topic in sport. That was the early 2000, 2004, 2003, and he was just about to publish a book chapter that kind of tried to articulate the relevance of perfectionism as a characteristic to sport. And so I just kind of got hooked on the topic. It then became a real keen interest at postgraduate level, PhD level, and I've spent the last 12 years or so studying perfectionism and whether kind of basically answering the question: is it good or bad to be more perfectionistic in sport?
So we talk about this term perfectionism. What actually is it? What precisely is perfectionism?
So perfectionism is a personality characteristic. It's something that people have to some degree a kind of genetic predisposition towards, and it's also something that we know is reinforced by the social environment, particularly during adolescence, mainly through parental practices. It's a characteristic that's broadly defined by the presence of two features, really. The first is the tendency to pursue unrealistically high standards, and the second is the tendency to engage in overly critical self-evaluation. And the two key words there is first is unrealistic. So the standards tend to be unrealistic in the sense they don't take into account personal or situational constraints, and to some degree maybe unnecessary given the situation. And then the key word for evaluative standards is overly. So it tends to be overly critical in that it's harsh, frequent, intense, and tends to be directed towards the self rather than the performance.
And you've written a chapter in a book, the Handbook of Self-Regulation and Motivation. So I suppose a sports psychology textbook around perfectionism myths, which is just an absolutely fascinating read. And I'd love to go through those myths now. And myth number one is perfectionism is just about personal standards. Perfectionism is just about personal standards. Take me through that a little bit, Andy.
Yeah, so when we talk about perfectionism, we tend to focus or think about it in the way that people pursue personally high standards for themselves, the demands that they place on themselves. But we've known for such a long time that perfectionism is much more than that. The kind of starting point is if you're just focusing on the standards, you're ignoring the evaluative concerns. The way in which people are thinking and feeling about their attempts to meet those goals. And in some ways, that's the more defining feature of perfectionism. The other way in which perfectionism is more than personal goals is there's a really popular and well-studied model of perfectionism that's come out of Canada. Gordon Flett and Paul Hewitt at Columbia University and University of York have argued that to better understand perfectionism, we need to understand where those standards are being directed. So they can be directed towards the self. So we normally call that self-oriented perfectionism when you demand perfection from your own performances. But they can also be directed at other people. So we call that other-orientated perfectionism. That's when you kind of have exceptionally high, unrealistically high standards for other people in your life. So it could be kind of your spouse, your partner, your friends, your family, your teammates. And then the final dimension that they focus on is something called socially prescribed perfectionism. This is where you perceive that other people expect you to be perfect. So straight away, we're getting a much more complex picture. Rather than just thinking about perfectionism as the standards that people have, it's a worldview really, how they give meaning to the successes and failures they have at reaching those standards. And it can also be directed towards the self, others, or perceived to be directed from other people. So it's to study perfectionism is really to study kind of a much broader array of features, and we really have to get away from the idea that this is just about the standards that people have, and study it as I said, more of a kind of a world view.
What I'm hearing you say there is the self. I can be perfectionist. I have a perfectionist tendency towards myself. I can direct perfectionism towards somebody else. I can demand that they engage in perfectionist behaviors or high standards towards perfectionism. I can be I can hold an attitude and an opinion that others prescribe on me a social perfectionism, a form of perfectionism. That feels like it has some repercussions for coaches. That if coaches engage in perfectionism, it's not just about themselves; it's also directed towards others as well. And that can influence their relationships. It can influence their capacity to coach effectively. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Absolutely. I, I often say that it can be really difficult living with perfectionism, but it's even more difficult living with someone else with it. This is a characteristic that certainly has implications for the quality of the relationships that you have with other people. Other orientated perfectionism is perhaps one of the least well understood and studied aspects of perfectionism in sport. But outside of sport, we have a great deal of information about other orientated perfectionism, and particularly how it leads to kind of more dominant, domineering, and kind of conflict orientated forms of coping in relationships, and how it can be difficult to foster and maintain mutually positive relationships with others if you are high in other oriented perfectionism. Similarly, there's overlap there with this kind of socially prescribed form of perfectionism. So if you're interacting with someone who is who's high in other oriented perfectionism, you may well experience higher perceptions that other people are demanding, because it's partly true. It's partly embedded in the interactions that you're having, and we know that's particularly damaging. Social prescribed perfectionism is probably the aspect of perfectionism that is most problematic from a well-being perspective. This idea that other people, and often it can be specific others, but it could just be a generalized sense of others, society, expects you to think, behave, look, perform in a certain way, and because you have very little control over those standards, that can be quite an oppressive way of viewing the world.
It makes me interesting thought there, an oppressive view of the world. I mean, as you're speaking there, and I'm just playing with ideas here, Andy. I'm thinking of coach athlete relationships. I'm thinking of coaching practice that if we agree that it's useful to have some forms of autonomy supportive coaching practice rather than controlled coaching all the time, to be authoritative rather than authoritarian, it almost feels like a form of perfectionism lends towards authoritarian, lends towards controlled coaching rather than the freedom of authoritative or autonomy supportive coaching.
Yeah, so I think if a coach is high in other oriented perfectionism, there's definitely it's almost certainly going to correlate with a high desire for control. And we've actually just published a study that illustrates when athletes perceive their coaches to be high in other oriented perfectionism, it predicts the level of burnout that the athlete is experiencing above their own perfectionistic personality characteristics themselves. So, we are beginning to uncover evidence that perfectionism, and in particular other oriented perfectionism, is problematic in coaches.
Interesting. Let's move on. I'd like to dwell on that at some point, and certainly explore this notion of perfectionism as a characteristic trait. And it feels like this is a good move on to myth number two. Myth number two being, strangely, perhaps to the reader, perfectionists exist. Are you suggesting that perfectionists don't exist?
Yes, I don't think perfectionists exist. People are often quite surprised to hear me say that, but this is the thinking behind this, right? There is no score on the scales that we use to measure perfectionism where we could say that if you score this value or above this value, you are a perfectionist, or if you score below this value, you are a perfectionist. Perfectionism exists to some degree in everyone. Some people are lower in perfectionism, some people are higher in perfectionism, and the majority of us are somewhere in between. Now, that's actually the case for most personality traits and characteristics. It would be unusual for perfectionism to exist as a typology, as types of people. So to study perfectionism is to study scores right across the continuum, is to ask ourselves what are the consequences of being lower on perfectionism, what are the consequences of being higher on perfectionism. So in some ways, it's an important myth because it makes perfectionism relevant to everyone, and it kind of debunks this idea that perfectionism is only relevant to the kind of 1%, the kind of tortured genius, the gifted and talented only. Lots of people in their lives wrestle with perfectionism, and it's not just sport; it can be any area of your life, really. There is actually a really cool study by Joachim Stobar at Kent University where he asked students in a community sample what areas of their life did they consider them to be perfectionistic. And if I recall correctly, only 4% of the student sample had no area of their life in which they were perfectionistic, and only 8% of the community sample had no area of their life in which they're perfectionistic. So the majority of these people were able to identify at least one area of their life where they consider themselves to be perfectionistic. And I believe the workplace was the most common area, but there were other areas, of course, studying, hygiene, appearance. Perfectionism is something that kind of manifests itself in areas that are important. So I think kind of to debunk that idea is really quite liberating, really, to start thinking about the relevance of perfectionism right across the board for everyone we encounter and for everyone we work with, as opposed to a kind of a small collective of individuals.
So what you're saying is everybody listening into this podcast right now is on a continuum of perfectionism. and in certain domains they might experience more of a sense of perfectionism, or be more perfectionistic than in other domains. Some people might be perfectionistic across lots of domains, but by and large, everybody experiences perfectionism or engages in perfectionistic tendencies at some point in time in some domains.
To some degree.
To some degree.
Yeah. Yeah, so you can see now the kind of picture that we're building up. So we've got like this multi-dimensional characteristic that can be directed to you, can be directed to others, or perceived from others. We've got levels in those dimensions. So you could be higher or lower in self-oriented perfectionism, and higher and lower in other-oriented perfectionism. And then we've also got the domains in which it manifests. So we've got these kind of three axes through which we can kind of visualize and consider people to be scoring. So yeah, we've got this quite complex picture of perfectionism potentially manifesting in different ways to different degrees in different domains. And then the challenge we have is to try and kind of ask ourselves, what are the consequences of being higher on this particular aspect in this particular domain, or being higher on one, lower in another in this particular domain? So the kind of consequences of being perfectionistic will vary based upon the level you have, the dimension you're exhibiting, and the domain in which it's exhibited.
So, is this a trait then? Because when you defined perfectionism, you mentioned, I think, personality and characteristic. Is it a trait, or is it a disposition?
Yeah, that's a great question, and so I've taken to describing it as a trans-contextual trait. And what I mean by that is it tends to be a feature that manifests in specific domains or aspects of people's life, but not necessarily all of them. But the fact that it does inconsistently manifest in areas of significance in someone's life makes it something more than a disposition. Can you see? Because if it only manifested in one domain of someone's life and not multiple
Yep.
domains, we could quite comfortably call it a disposition. But because it has this a tendency and can manifest in multiple domains, and that's a feature of what it's like. I think it's probably a little bit more stable than a disposition, but maybe not as stable as something like the Big Five. So it's kind of trait like a second order personality characteristic. So to coach it in kind of sport and exercise psychology, it's more stable than say goal orientations, like these kind of views about or views and beliefs about performance. So ego or task orientation, it's certainly
Yep.
more stable than that. But as I say, it perhaps is kind of secondary to neuroticism, conscientiousness, openness, and the like.
Really interesting. We had Dan McAdams on, the personality scientist, a few weeks ago, and he spoke to traits and adaptations, essentially. And so, what I hear you say is that perfectionism, whilst it might not be one of the big five, and Dan McAdams took us through the big five: openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion, neuroticism. Whilst it might not be, it's not one of the big fives. It kind of folds into the big five, maybe across neuroticism, maybe across conscientiousness, and it can potentially relate to an adaptation, maybe a value, a belief, a goal, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And his work is amazing and has been influential in our attempt to resolve this kind of question about, is this something that is more dispositional, more malleable, more changeable, more learned, or is it something that is much more deeply ingrained and much more stable and less changeable? Um, you know, I guess it might be worth raising the issue of what we understand about where it comes from, to try and pick that apart and the complexity. So there are a couple of studies that have looked at the heritability, the genetic heritability of perfectionism, and that have illustrated that it does have similar levels of heritability of the big five, just below. So there is something kind of ingrained in us in terms of propensities towards perfectionism. But the vast majority of the work that's looked at perfectionism has focused on kind of social learning, social modelling. The way in which parental and formative experiences can tease out and reinforce perfectionistic qualities. So, you know, it is a tricky question about how stable is this thing, and we obviously know that personality changes across the lifespan as well. What we're really talking about is something that is likely to have at least some shared overlap with what we would typically consider to be a trait, but we kind of hang our hat on the idea that it's probably a little bit more changeable and malleable than something like the big five.
If you were to hang your hat on any of the big five, what continuum would perfectionism fold into? For me, immediate conscientiousness, being industrious, being achievement striving, seeking competence and feeling competent. It feels like perfectionism most readily folds into that continuum.
Yes, I think you were right in when you first raised this issue. Perfectionism tends to the dimensions of perfectionism tend to load on either conscientiousness or neuroticism, depending on the particular aspect that you focus upon. So they do share the kind of conscientious achievement striving facet. They tend to plan, they tend to be diligent, they tend to be committed, but they also tend to have a kind of neurotic way of viewing their achievement attempts as well. And we've got one study where we compared self-orientated perfectionism, so the tendency to demand perfection from yourself, with conscientious achievement striving. And you find where you find the overlap is this commitment to high standards, but where you find the difference is that you tend to find more self-criticism, more doubts, more concerns, and more fear of failure attached to self-oriented perfectionism than you do to conscientiousness. So it kind of bridges and loads on both.
I wonder if that's a neat segue to myth three, because as you're speaking there, I'm thinking of, I've worked now, this is my 25th year in high performance sport as a competitor, as a coach, and over the last 15 years as a sports psychologist. And boy, I mean, the amount of times I've heard perfectionism is good. We want to be perfectionist. We want to strive to be to perfect our skills. And in myth three of this chapter, you talk about, well, the myth is perfectionism is necessary to be successful. And Andy, this is just for me, it's something I've heard year after year after year, that to be a perfectionist is a good thing because it drives us forward. It helps us strive for excellence. You're saying that's a myth.
Yeah, I think it is a myth, and I think it's a pervasive myth in sport. I think the picture is far more complex. I think what we really need to be asking ourselves is, for who and when does perfectionism lead to better performance and better kind of well-being, motivation outcomes? And I think when we start asking ourselves that question, when and for whom, and we start studying perfectionism across kind of developmentally across time, and we take a kind of broader perspective of the athlete and their lives, I think it reveals that perfectionism is highly problematic from a performance and motivation perspective, and not least a mental health perspective. So that's not to say that if you focused on discrete moments in time, that you might see some desirable or apparently desirable behaviours. But I think if you look below the surface and consider kind of the motivational underpinning of perfectionism. It reveals itself to be almost, to be undesirable. Let me explain. So let's look at the first thing. Let's look at what, perfectionism is a powerful motivational force. Okay, so perfectionism is a powerful motivational force. People who are highly perfectionistic do or can strive really hard, be really dedicated, persevere, be really committed. But it's also a very highly powerful motivational force in the opposite direction. People who are highly perfectionistic don't like to do things that can't be done perfectly. They don't like to take risks that things might reveal themselves to be incompetent or less than perfect. So that's why we know there's quite a lot of research outside of sport that links it to things like procrastination, to self-handicapping. Now, we also know that if you're perfectionistic, you don't respond particularly well to failure because it reveals incompetence. So in our own lab, we've done a series of studies that illustrate that single failures on kind of fairly meaningless tasks, non-real world tasks, kind of psychologometer tasks, failure against personal goals, failure against other people, is enough to trigger quite strong emotional responses, higher levels of shame, higher levels of guilt, lower levels of pride, higher levels of threat, and also the withdrawal of effort. So just single failure events are enough to evoke a very strong motivational response, but it's a motivational avoidance response. Now, these are kind of discrete events that we can kind of manufacture within the lab, but now imagine it in a real world context against the developmental lifespan of an athlete. These don't seem to be especially desirable characteristics to have in athletes. People who are not willing to persevere or take risks and have, as I say, very acute emotional responses to failure. We can also draw upon qualitative work that illustrate that while people can continue to perform well and be perfectionistic, what's happening in the background more holistically is it's having a quite destructive impact on their well-being and mental health. We know outside of sport, perfectionism can be extremely destructive. Eating disorders, anxiety disorders, depression, in the most extreme cases, suicide ideation, and kind of suicide attempts, even in some cases. So there's an extremely dark side of perfectionism that we tend not to focus on in sport, that I think makes a compelling backdrop to any instances where we see or perfectionism contributed to seemingly desirable characteristics, or the anecdotal accounts of highly successful athletes describing themselves as being perfectionistic.
From a granular perspective, I love what you write in the chapter about perfectionists don't take into account task constraints or personal constraints when engaging in practice or performance. By that, what you mean is um, if the task that they're engaging in is tough, really tough, they don't take that into account and remain overly harsh on themselves. They don't necessarily take into account any kind of forms of injury or anything like that. They're just, I suppose, in basic terms, perfectionism, this has to be perfect, this has to be perfect, this has to be perfect. And when it's not, they're kind of blind. Their blind spots are towards say, hey, yeah, but this was really tough. This was a tough to attain activity. It's okay that I didn't attain that. Or, hey, look, I've got a little bit of a knock. I can't expect myself to be able to optimally engage in this right now. They don't have that necessarily. They they have those blind spots, and that can be a problem. Is I think what you're saying is towards their performance, but also to their well-being as well.
Yeah, for sure. Perfectionism is characterized by a certain kind of cognitive experience that is ongoing, an internal dialogue that's ongoing all the time. We've described it previously as kind of overthinking. They're ruminating all the time, they're worrying all the time. It's a form of rigid, dictonomous, catastrophizing way of thinking that is always ongoing, and is always kind of challenging themselves to engage, to validate who they are through their performances. So that can be highly problematic. For example, if what they need to be doing is resting, or they encounter any task that can't be dealt with just with pure brute effort, because they're very good at that. But what they're not very good at is adapting, reflecting, reappraisal, all the key self-regulatory skills that allow you to persist for long enough to accrue the skills required to perform at the highest level consistently without kind of damaging your sense of welfare or well-being.
As you're speaking now, I was thinking, this is just playing with an idea, playing with a thought, and I'm sure there's possibly no empirical evidence to this, but mechanistic sports versus team invasion sports or open play sports, it almost feels like, if we're talking about flexibility along that continuum and across domains, that if I'm involved with a sport that might be perceived as more mechanistic, like say cycling, and there are times and there is technology heavily involved, cycling, maybe rowing, sports like that, versus open skilled sports, team invasion sports such as basketball, soccer, etc. I don't know if there's any empirical work around perfectionism and the differences of these sports. Could you potentially be higher on the continuum with mechanistic sports and get away with it more as compared to open skilled sports? Because open skilled sports is ultimately, look, you can't perfect everything. You've got to take risks, etc., etc. Does that make sense, Andy?
Yeah, well, I think there's a reason why perfectionism, or people with high levels of perfectionism, may be overrepresented in sport, and that's because if you're high in perfectionism, sport offers a domain in which you can indulge or strive towards perfection like no other domain. And sport loves a perfectionist. Look, the idea of perfection is revered. And the kind of underpinning idea of flawlessness, relentless striving, and even personal sacrifice in the pursuit of kind of glory sits well within sport. But I think we're kind of almost stumbling on. We're still in the same myth, but we're stumbling on another aspect of this myth. Is why is it then? Why is it do we find people who either self-identify or other people identify them as perfectionists in sport? And I think there are lots of possible explanations for that. That is not necessarily that perfectionism is required for high levels of performance. So, one possibility why we see lots of people who are higher in perfectionism in sport is that, as we just said, it's quite a desirable domain to be in if you have a proclivity towards pursuing perfection. Sport another alternative is sport may reject people who are unwilling to buy into that mentality. So you kind of get an attrition effect. So people just kind of whittle away as you move through certain sports and certain levels of certain standards over time. And then the third possibility is that you might arrive not particularly perfectionistic, but sport ingrains it in you. It's a learned mentality as a consequence of experience in the sport environment, particularly at the higher levels. But none of those explanations are causal, in the sense that none of them suggest that perfectionism causes higher levels of success. There are alternative explanations for why we end up, particularly at the higher levels, of more perfectionistic individuals than less perfectionistic individuals.
I just think it's so fascinating, Andy. I mean, I'm sitting here listening to this, and off air, I said to you, look, my background is I was a pro golfer, and I grew up at a time when I started playing golf at a time when Sir Nick Faldo, the English professional golfer, the greatest British professional golfer that there's been, arguably, probably. And Sir Nick was probably quite vocal in terms of certainly his rigorous practice regimes and his yearning to perfect the golf swing. But there's so many interesting nuances to that. I mean, I say that because I was very heavily influenced. I was kind of, as you were speaking, I was thinking about that, being inculcated into the culture of sport, into the culture of that extraordinary excellence that you perceive that you acquire. And Andy, look, I'm saying this, and I don't know if you have any interest or any knowledge of golf, but I think the fascinating thing is, on the one hand, Sir Nick Faldo, and there's no blame attached to him at all. He's still one of my heroes. On the one hand, he's talking about perfecting the golf swing and perfecting the shots, but then on the other hand, he talks about the importance of practicing his chipping quite a lot. And when you actually add those up, it's just like, okay, well, if you're saying that you need to practice your chipping because you're going to miss a lot of greens, then actually that kind of contrasts with the notion of, but I've got to perfect the golf swing. I've got to perfect the golf kick. On the one hand, you're saying I can perfect this, and on the other hand, you're saying, but I'm going to hit bad shots, so I've got to work on my chipping. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, I think if you pursue exceptionally high goals,
Mm,
and let's even dare to call them you're trying to perfect something, that doesn't necessarily make you a perfectionist. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to score really high on perfectionism.
okay.
Perfectionism is much more than that. It's much more than just goal setting. We could debate how adaptive perfect goals are versus optimally challenging goals, but it's nonetheless just a goal setting exercise. I mean, we could set up a session tomorrow where we ask people to pursue on a discrete task, try to do this task perfectly. Whereas, as we kind of touched upon, perfectionism is just as much, if not more, about what people think and feel about themselves when they don't achieve those standards. So in that particular case, what we might be picking upon there is that golf or his kind of goal setting allowed him to set quite perfect
Yep.
goals, but perhaps he was far better at kind of regulating or managing the kind of negative thought processes that we've also
Yep.
discussed. He was unaltered or unburdened by the concerns and doubts and fears that we consider equally as important when we're characterizing perfectionism.
Yeah. Yeah. Really interesting, and makes me think of that notion of flexibility. I mean, we haven't spoken about how one deals with a perfectionistic tendency in a particular domain at a particular time, but the capacity to be flexible, that you could set yourselves tough to achieve objectives or goals, whilst holding the capacity to flex emotionally around accomplishing those goals or not accomplishing those goals. I mean, with goal setting in mind, Andy, and again, I don't know if you can draw upon the research or just draw upon your own sort of experience or your own opinion here. Um, I, as a sports psychologist, I have I suppose. I'm trying to think of the word I want to use here. Almost like a negative relationship with outcome goals. If I sit down with a client, we're often setting process goals, and if they want to set an outcome goal, then then we set that. But it almost feels like you can inject perfectionism into someone, or a sense of perfectionistic tendency into somebody, by saying, here's the outcome goal, this is a fixed rigid thing that you're trying to attain, and there's not a lot of flexibility around that. No question, mate, but I just wonder what your thoughts are on that whole goal setting thing and perfectionism.
Yeah, so I guess from a motivational regulation perspective, so how intensely people pursue their goals over time, I think that's
Mm.
where the flexibility becomes really important, and that's where outcome goals aren't great. Like I personally would couch or kind of counter the tendency to set perfect goals as wanting to make things better. Like that's what we're trying to achieve here. Wherever your competency level is right now, we need to make that better. How do we make that better? I think that's a better conversation to have, particularly with people who are perfectionistic, and we have to think about and frame the conversation about what happens when we don't make these things better. What do we do then? You look. So I definitely recognise the outcome goals. I mean, how problematic they can be. I mean, there is some people who have written about goal setting outside of sport in a kind of therapeutic context that say you should really kind of starve perfectionists of goals. They love a goal. They love the rigidity, the clarity of goal setting. But ultimately, it just becomes a stick that they beat themselves with. So I think the complexity of perfectionism kind of can be evidenced against other kind of goal related concepts. So um, perfectionism tends to be positively related to ego goals and task goals. It tends to be related to intrinsic, identified, introjected, and external goals. From a quantitative and qualitative perspective, it's high in quantity and high in every level of qualitative different forms of regulation. As we touched upon, it's highly motivational, like a construct. So the degree to which goal setting can be effective in terms of managing perfectionism, I think to some degree it may be, but you're better off thinking about it from the kind of cognitive perspective that we just described. The goals that they set are a secondary, almost I want to say symptom of their perfectionism, and how they use goal setting to serve the
Mm.
need to fulfill this extreme desire for accomplishment, to feel good about themselves. And for me, that's what's at the heart of perfectionism, really. The need to constantly validate who you are and the inability to internalize a stable sense of self-esteem and self-worth.
So I think we've probably spoken a bit towards myth number 4, but I would love for you to speak a bit more to this myth. Perfectionism is good for you. Tell me a little bit about that myth.
Yeah, so. Firstly, that's trying to encourage kind of a much broader, holistic view of perfectionism and the impact that it will have on an athlete. You know, I think I briefly mentioned about the qualitative work that we've done. We've got some really good accounts of kind of Olympic athletes, professional dancers, professional musicians, people who are highly successful and who have identified as being perfectionistic. And they really bring home the need to think about perfectionism outside of that specific domain. The one thing they have all had in common is they were very successful and self-identified as perfectionists, but they also provided very similar accounts about the sacrifices that they've made outside of their lives, personal relationships, but also to their own well-being and kind of mental health, and the toll that they had accepted as part of being perfectionistic and the goals of being successful in those relative domains. I think there is a compelling backdrop to the study of perfectionism in sport that is provided by the mental health literature, counselling, clinical psychology, that suggests that this is a vulnerability factor for a whole range of potential clinical outcomes. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to experience clinical outcomes because, as we just discussed, people are perfectionistic to some degree. But we know that the more perfectionistic you are, the more vulnerable you are to experiencing the more extreme potential outcomes of perfectionism. And I think we're only just beginning to get to grips with that in sport. And I have to say, the most worrying trend is to see perfectionism discussed in absence of that backdrop. The idea that there are functional or adaptive or healthy forms of perfectionism is highly problematic in my opinion. And the data that we have so far at least suggests that perfectionistic concerns, much like it is outside of sport, is related to things like depressive symptoms inside of sport. um, my personal opinion is that there is nothing unique or special about sport from a perfectionistic perspective. If you are perfectionistic, you are vulnerable to the same issues. The uniqueness of sport comes from from the context itself, what we just described. We have a domain where it's actively encouraged. Um, so, uh, for me, it's the most worrying myth that somehow you can be perfectionistic and it won't come at any cost at all.
Andy, I know that you're an academic sports psychologist. Your world is research. You don't consult as such. But I would love to get your take on how you feel that we can help people who suffer emotional challenges, emotional trauma, mental challenges as a consequence of experiencing perfectionism um, in certain domains some of the time. What's your thoughts on that? What have you experienced? What research is out there?
Yeah. Okay. So from a sports psychologist perspective, I think the first thing you can do is become more literate from a mental health and perfectionism perspective. So we sometimes describe that as perfectionism literacy. You can better understand what it is, better understand the landscape. By engaging in things like this podcast, reading widely, so you can arm yourself with being able to better identify what this thing is. Right. If your athletes begin to demonstrate some clinically relevant signs and symptoms, um, you have to refer them, to get support from a trained professional. And we know perfectionism is a vulnerability factor for that. I think the role of sports psychologists and the role of coaches is in primary prevention. Working with people who are perfectionistic but have yet to experience any kind of clinical issues. So by creating environments, giving them skills to better manage their perfectionism and avoid the development of any clinical outcomes before they have chance to manifest. Now, so if we talk about those two issues, so if an athlete is perfectionistic and has developed signs of clinical issues, we know from research outside of sport that there are a range of therapies that can effectively help manage perfectionism and reduce perfectionistic qualities. So cognitive behavioural therapy is probably the most widely used therapy, and there is evidence that it can be effective. There's a couple of meta-analyses that have illustrated that, and there's also a recent meta-analysis that have illustrated it in context of eating disorders. Now, inside of sport, so if these issues haven't manifested yet, there are a small number of studies that have looked at the use of similar skills or skills that have similar kind of principles of CBT. So they've looked at things like mindfulness, compassion-based interventions, kind of self-help CBT books, and those have at least some effectiveness based upon current research. And that's something increasingly coaches are familiar with, routinely use, or can obtain CPD in to allow them to work with non-clinical issues. We've also started a line of research looking at perfectionistic climates. So the idea that perfectionism is not only a personal quality, but it can be a quality of the environment, the social environment, the kind of cues and information that's given to them in their interactions with coaches or other significant others in the environment, so parents, for example. So we've just started that line of research, and we think it's going to be particularly fruitful for better uncovering and coach education in and around maintaining healthier, less perfectionistic environments. So creating environments that are adaptive for everyone. And that approach is really based on achievement goal theory and self-determination theory, where a lot of sport and exercise psychologists and coaches will be familiar with those frameworks. So it's what do coaches do, what can they do to either reduce perfectionistic thinking in athletes or help moderate the consequences of thinking perfectionistically in the environment.
And so, going on what you've just said there, achievement goal theory and self-determination theory, what you're suggesting is coaches can use those two, goal achievement theory, self-determination theory, both of which we've discussed on the Sports Psych show, as frameworks to foster a healthier and safer coaching environment, where they may be able to turn down the volume, of individual players' perfectionist tendencies.
Yes, yeah, and in fact, there is some evidence that more autonomous climates and more task-oriented climates can reduce the relationship between perfectionism and things like burnout and similar related constructs. The perfectionistic climate idea is kind of much like achievement goal theory will draw your attention to anything that's encouraging kind of comparative information or normative information rather than personal information. And then much like self-determination theory will draw your attention to kind of controlling structures that you've put in place versus autonomous. We think you can think about the environment from a perfectionistic perspective. So what are you doing or saying? How are you structuring sessions that may lead athletes to believe that perfection is required or anything less than perfection is unacceptable? So we focus on things like the standards, how the standards or the how high the standards are in the environment. Are they flexible? Are they adaptive? Or are they rigid? We talk about things like criticism in the environment. You know, how frequent is criticism? What's it directed towards? How intense is it? We talk about even things like conditional regard or controlling behaviours have some overlap. You know, are coaches leveraging parts of the environment to get their athletes to perform perfectly? I mean, for example, the language that they use. How often are they told that needs to be perfect? How often are they told that needs to be done again till it's perfect? We've all heard kind of practice makes perfect. Okay, and this all will engender a mindset that encourage athletes to think about things perfectionistically. And we also talk about anxiousness as well. You know, to what degree do coaches project anxiety about mistakes and the consequences of mistakes? You know, environments that are highly anxious can lead to more perfectionistic thinking.
Really fascinating there. I love that. I just want to reflect back some of the things I heard there. Achievement goal theory and self-determination theory as models to help adjust the climate, your coaching climate. Achievement goal theory for everybody, we can be engaged in an ego orientation or a task orientation. So ego is other referenced, everyone's comparing, you're comparing yourselves against each other. It's probably more of a what could be construed as a competitive environment in terms of trying to beat each other, whereas a task orientation is more self-referenced. You're focused on your skills yourself, obviously translating that from a very basic perspective. And then self-determination theory, helping, in very simple terms, helping players become more providing them with a greater sense of autonomy, relatedness, and competence. And what I hear you say, Andy, is just monitoring your communication. Are you being flexible? Are you being adaptable? Or are you being rigid in your language? And I think of irrational emotive stuff there. I think of musts and have tos and catastrophizings and authalizings. How you talked about criticism. How intense is your criticism, volume, tone, etc. Again, are you engaged in all or nothing communication there? You talked about controlling behaviors again versus autonomy supportive coaching behaviors. And what I also loved that you referenced there was anxiety. As a coach, are you projecting a sense of anxiety onto your players as a consequence of the mistakes they're making, their standards of play, etc.? There's so much around coach behavior there that I think is that mediates that climate, Andy. I think that's just fantastic stuff. Um, any with regard all of that, any final thoughts? I mean, I just gave you a 2-minute spiel of what I heard. Did you have any reflections on what I said there? Any overarching thoughts?
Um, Coaches have a significant role to play in developing, maximizing the potential of athletes at every level and safeguarding the welfare of athletes. And I think athletes who are perfectionistic are particularly in need of kind of purposeful, thoughtful coaching.
Brilliant. Andy, that's fantastic. It's a complex subject, isn't it? And I like the deep dive we've done. I don't mind the academic terms and approach, because I think the work you're doing is helping us, whether it's us as sports psychology consultants or coaches, actually understand what is a complex subject matter. And I think sometimes if we take it for granted and we just say, and we look at this in simple terms, simplistic terms, overly simplistic terms, actually it doesn't help us. It doesn't help us form those healthy and safe environments. It doesn't help us adopt the kind of coaching behaviors that produces that helps players participate, engage healthily and safely, effectively, optimally. It doesn't help them progress, learn and grow as people. It doesn't help them. Hey, it doesn't help them perform um, consistently under pressure, which is relevant for those at the very elite end. So I think that granular look is so important, Andy. That would be my final thought there. I think that we've taken a deep dive, but I think that granular perspective is really, really important. It feeds healthy and safe practices, coaching practices, and coaching environments.
I agree completely, Dan. So thanks very much for your time.
Awesome. Okay, look, Andy, let's finish off here by just I know you're on social media, and I know this really will have tapped the interest of many people listening in. So, how can people follow you and find your papers and your book chapters, etc.?
Yep. So I am on Twitter. I believe it's at underscore AP Hill. Um, I have a webpage on the university website, which has my email address attached. So if people want to receive the book chapters or any of the work that we spoke about, I'm happy to receive emails and requests. And we also have an institutional repository where all of the research is publicly available anyway, but that's called Ray. So if you just type in YSJU Ray, it'll take you to that repository and just look me up. But more than happy to hear from your listeners and continue the conversation.
Brilliant. Professor Andy Hill, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, everybody, that was a fantastic and fascinating podcast. And I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, Dan Abrahams, to tell me what you think of the Sports Site Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.